with Middle East Now here on I24 News. Iran and China have agreed to expand their military cooperation. That's according to Iran, and this comes during a visit by the Chinese defense minister to Tehran. Now, more on this with Behnam Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Professor Uzi Rabi, director of Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East Studies at Tel Aviv University. Good evening to you both, gentlemen. Mr. Taleblu, I'd like to start with you. Iran, China, what's the ideological or even practical basis for this kind of cooperation?
Well, military cooperation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the People's Republic of China is nothing new, but it has expanded significantly. After the Iran-Iraq War ended, many of Iran's earlier long-range strike capabilities, and in particular anti-ship cruise missile capabilities, came by way of China. We also know in this period there was Chinese support to Iran's nuclear program and larger long-range strike aspirations in the ballistic missile space. But significantly in the recent era, it was China in the pre-deal, during deal, and post-deal period that was the largest licit and illicit importer of Iranian crude oil and petroleum products. Therefore, Iran looks to China as a lifeline to get around sanctions, to be able to fund its destabilizing revolutionary foreign and security policy, as well as also to advocate on its behalf within the P5+1 negotiating mechanism. And both of these countries do see the contest with the West, and in particular with America, as zero-sum. And any kind of erosion of the U.S.-led order is a win for either side. So if China does look to empower Iran militarily and tighten military ties, something they've looked to do since 2016, it would be counted as a win both in Tehran and in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Professor Rabi?
Sorry, and in Beijing, not Washington. It would be a loss in Washington.
We'll talk about Washington in a minute. Professor Rabi?
Well, I think that, first of all, I agree. And I think that what Iran is doing is just capitalizing on what was said before me. Iran knows that it can play the cards in kind of a very skillful way. Basically, this is not new, as was said. And Iran is definitely having in mind sending sort of a signal, I think, to both U.S. and Europe, by which to say two things. First of all, if somebody thinks that we can leave it behind the abandoned 2015 deal, and if that is not being nailed down, so we are going to have some other options. And the second thing is that Iran is not isolated. Iran could build up or can come up with kind of an axis by which actually to just make it up for itself and create kind of a real new situation when it comes to the geopolitical panorama. So I don't think that this is consternation. This is not an Iranian consternation. This is an Iranian, definitely very skillfully calculated game by which to create kind of an alternatives and let Europe and the U.S., especially the U.S., look at it and have a second thought about the deal which was left behind.
So what is the impact, Professor Rabi, on the current negotiations on the nuclear deal?
Well, I think that the Iranians would like to have that deal. I think the Americans do. But, what the Iranian came up with is kind of a request which is very, very problematic with regard actually to lifting the sanctions when it comes to the Revolutionary Guards. This is something that is kind of a cause for debate even in American politics. And the Americans would like actually to have the deal, but they cannot at the meantime actually have their consent for this, what we call kind of a precondition or condition that was put by Iran. I think that what we do see the tilt towards China, which is not a new thing, is kind of another actually message to the United States to hurry up, to speed it up, and to conclude or nail down this agreement of 2015. It is good for both parties, but, we have kind of a very, very problematic scene here in the world. We have Russia, Ukraine. This is something that makes both Iran and China actually reconsider their, future strategies, and this is why they are coming up with that together.
Agree with that, Mr. Taleblu?
Partially, I would just add on a little bit here. That it's not only tactical in the sense that Iran is deepening its ties with China to simply try to expedite more American concessions. I think what we've seen now for about a decade and a half of ultra-hardline Iranian elites, but particularly a willingness on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that designated terrorist organization the guest mentioned, a willingness on their behalf to be a smaller element, to be a pawn perhaps in the larger strategic considerations of America's near-peer great power competitors like Russia and China. So in that sense, the Iranian movement closer and closer to Beijing and also Moscow is not only to get concessions, but it's also part of this broader strategic axis that the Islamic Republic and its new ultra-hardline elite are increasingly willing to be a part of. And this means, this is in many ways erosion of Iran's sovereignty. It's a point of pressure when you get a nationalist population against an Islamist regime, and that's one of many points of friction between state and society inside Iran. But it's something to look at in the medium to long term, because this is where the Islamic Republic is signaling it's headed for economic reasons, political reasons, and as the trip by the Chinese defense minister shows, military reasons as well.
Now, Professor Rabi, we have China, which is a nuclear power. We have Iran, which has nuclear aspirations. Could it lead to nuclear cooperation?
Well, that is something which is, in my opinion, it's a nightmare for many, many states in the region and beyond. And I do agree that if the Americans are not coming up with something that would, make Iran be satisfied with the situation, what we can have here, and I think that we should prevent that, or the Americans, is sort of a new axis which definitely actually speaks or send a signal to what I would call the newly created geopolitical situation, worldly speaking. And this is why I think that we are at a crossroads. It remains to be seen actually how the players, especially the United States...
Who's going to stop the Chinese? Mr. Taleblu, let me ask you, if China decides to help Iran get nuclear, who's going to stop them?
Well, what we've seen mostly from the Chinese so far is turning a blind eye and permitting, in fact, many of the long-standing illicit procurement networks that have helped make the Islamic Republic's nuclear and missile program what we know it to be today. The fear really is if the Chinese actively begin to do it and do it as an element of state policy and expedite it and do so on the back end of a failed deal or a short-term deal, or as a way to really dig in further inside the Middle East against America by making the Iranian problem an even larger problem. I think it is going to be a real sanctions challenge for America. We're seeing Washington take some of the broader authorities and capabilities it developed against Iran over the past decade, economically, legally, politically, and begin to be able to scale them up and create multilateral coalitions to deal with Russia. The million-dollar question is, or perhaps the billion-dollar question is, to what degree is Washington willing, capable, and ready to do so against China in the scenario you mentioned?
I think you both agree on that, the million-dollar question. I'll take the $1 million. You give me the answer because there's no answer. Thank you very much, and good evening to you both. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.